I'd just like to say welcome all of you to this session, and especially like to welcome Sarah Raven, who's my kind of person. I think that her attributes as a gardener and a cook and an educator and a broadcaster and a writer, my God, this is just a wonderful, wonderful panoply of skills. Really looking forward to your talk, Sarah. I'm not going to stand between the talk and the audience. You have a PowerPoint to show, right? So why don't you just...
I know that sounds boring, but I hope it won't be.
No, and then after the PowerPoint, we'll chat.
Yeah.
Right? Please go ahead.
So I might stand there, actually. Except I now can't see. Oh, there. No, I'm going to stand here then. So you can see from this picture what sort of gardener I am, really. And I am a gardener. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to give this talk from a very strictly scientific point of view. I trained as a medic, so I understand a little bit about science, so I will skirt over the new research, but I will touch on it. Oh, you can't hear me. Sorry. So I am a gardener, not a scientist, is what I was saying. So I did train to be a doctor, so I'm not scared of science, but this isn't going to be a technical pollinator science talk at all. It's going to be about how we as individuals can affect the decline in the pollinator. And so, this picture shows you one of the main reasons that I came to garden was because I love colour. And so next slide. And so India, for me, is just a continual exhilarating experience. And we don't get colour like that in the UK, so I have to import it with my garden plants. Because, this is a picture I took in Jaipur 3 days ago, and I love blue and I love orange, and so this for me was a sort of dream. And next slide. As is this is a vision for me, and this is really what I'm trying to create in my garden. This sort of picture is exactly the sort of garden that I want. I do not want tasteful mauves and mushroom and soft grey linen. I want things that get me out of bed in the morning and that are exhilarating. So it's sort of not about good taste for me, it's about spirit lifting, really. So next slide. And it's about this too. My garden is about picking, because I like to bring nature and the garden into the house. We live in a very rainy, cold climate, and so you can't always be in the garden, as you could hear. So bringing it in is a very nice exercise, and I've always been addicted since a young child, to picking flowers. So next slide. And so this is what I do, sort of less and less actually, but this was my daily bread for ages after studying medicine, is I became a florist, but I wanted to grow the flowers rather than just buy them from monocultural polytunnel culture, which bored me rigid, because you have the same height of stem, the same perfect straight stem, which doesn't interest me. So I started growing cut flowers. And next slide. So that I could have abundance and colour in my life on a daily basis. This was actually doing the flowers for my niece's wedding. Juliet Nicholson is here talking, and this was her daughter's wedding. And then next slide. And it's this thing about abundance. So I can pick gladioli by the 100, and it costs me almost nothing, because I have a garden full of these sort of plants. So that is really, I garden for colour, I garden for abundance, and I garden for the pollinators. Next slide. And next slide. And next slide. So for the pollinators, it's also very important to me, and we across the world, but I know more about the UK, obviously, we have a massive decline in pollinators. It varies, with different bumblebees have gone into extinction. We've already lost 4 bumblebees in the last 20 years. This is a bumblebee, but it applies across the board. One of the reasons I got drawn into research into pollinators was that when I started gardening 25 years ago in Sussex, my garden was aflutter with butterflies. Now, I practically scream with delight when I see a butterfly. And that applies across the board. So next slide. You can see even things like the gladioli, if you grow the right ones, the bees immediately go to it for forage. And next slide. And what one has to remember when you're planting, and I'll go into this in more detail, but you need to remember to plant for nectar and for pollen. And poppies have no nectar, but they have a ton of pollen. And pollen is rich in protein, nectar is rich in carbohydrate, but they need both. And this is a butterfly feeding for nectar. And next slide. And that is a hoverfly. We all love our bees and we love our butterflies, but we forget the poor old wasp and the poor old hoverfly. And they're as important, if not more important, in the whole thing of what pollinators do, which we're coming on to. Hoverflies are absolutely crucial pollinators. Next slide. So the person that has done the research in India is a guy in Calcutta called Dr. Basu. And what is the problem is me bringing this to India is obviously I'm skating on thin ice, really. But actually, of course, what is happening in the UK is also happening in India. And this particular academic has done huge research in the last 20 years to prove that that is the case. But unfortunately, there is not a baseline here of measurement of insect populations. That is it going up, is it going down? Well, obviously it's going down, but there's nothing to measure it against. So that's one of the things that he's concentrating on. So next slide. And so, you know, that it's all very sad losing our pollinators. Of course, for biodiversity, it's terrible. And for someone like me, I was brought up in nature. I'm a botanist by childhood training by my father. And I can see this thing of the shifting baseline, which is, as I say, with the butterflies, but also with wildflowers. I'm 54, even in my lifetime, I mean, I used to botanize from about the age of 6 to about the age of 16, and you can imagine what then diverted me at the age of 16. But until that point, I used to botanize every weekend, and now the lanes are a very, very different story, which we will go into a little bit more. But is it beyond sad? Is there other things? I mean, of course, you will know that it is. And next slide. This is why it's important rather than just sad. So this, again, I took in Jaipur 3 days ago, and this will be gone, as will next slide, as will next slide, as will next slide, as will next slide. So this is a very ugly slide, but it really is the nub of what we're talking about, which is on one side you see the supermarket, the grocery store without pollinators. There are oranges for breakfast. On the other side, there's much, much more. And it's because pollinators pollinate. And there are some things like grains that are wind pollinated. The flowers are wind pollinated to produce their produce, but an awful lot, a greater majority, are insect pollinated. So, of course, you might say, well, you can import honeybees to do that, but actually they're in crisis too. So, next slide. It's not just about a varied diet, being nice to eat, nicer to eat. It's also about health. And this is actually a slide I stole from my husband's talk. He's giving a talk at exactly the same moment about the plight of the seabird. But this is a very jolly puffin. And the reason that this jolly puffin is an important thing for us all to think about is he has got very orange feet and a very orange beak, only in the breeding season. But that is because he's eaten an awful lot of shrimps to then concentrate the anthocyanins, the keratins, in his feet and in his beak. And what that signals is that I'm a really healthy chap and I'm a good breeding partner. And that is the thing, is that you want your vegetables, your carotenoids, your anthocyanins, your lycopenes, all those pigments, you want those to make you jolly healthy. And so without the next slide, we are less healthy. So this is 3-colored beetroot, but it's a good example of how you need a rainbow of food, and it's widely proven. We just did a talk on the health of eating. It's very important, and without the pollinators, this is out of the window. Next slide. It's not just about that, too. I'm afraid these are very boring, unpretty slides, but it's about economics, and you can see from that slide. So 220, well, yeah, on we go. And in India, it's even more important than in the UK. In the UK, it's 4% of the GDP. Here, it's 20%. Next slide. And again, you know, we are second here in India to China in vegetable production. So as good old David Attenborough said, if we disappeared, the world just carries on. But if insects disappeared, we're done for. And that is really the reason that it's important, and it's an important subject that we can't go on ignoring. Okay, next slide. Okay, so why is this happening? Very, very quickly, I promise I'm not going to go into the science because that will bore everybody very quickly. We will go through these. One is habitat destruction. It's the same in the UK as it is in India, so next slide. This, I think, is quite a useful picture. I know very much not of a botanical spectrum that you have here, but this is a lane next to where I live, and on one side of the lane is never been treated with a herbicide or any agricultural chemical or any agricultural process. And on the other side, next slide, is what it looks like. And okay, one is in shade, one is in sun, but they would have looked the same or similar, and that biodiversity would have related across the hedge. But because this has been drenched with chemicals, agricultural chemicals, and also agricultural processes, the flowers have gone, and flowers are where you get the pollen and the nectar. So it's no longer in nature. And here is a wildflower, a wild narcissus wood or orchard in Shropshire, and here is the other side of that hedge. So again, it's gone. And that has happened here in India too. We're going to hear much more about that, about deforestation. And next slide. And so just to reiterate, what you're looking for is a source of nectar and a source of pollen. So in the middle of that flower, you very clearly see the golden pollen, and that is what the pollinators need. They need the nectar to feed themselves with the carbohydrate. They need the pollen to feed the grubs and to take back to the hive to strengthen the hive, because it's the protein. And next slide. And there you can see the pollen on the back legs of that bumblebee. So it's carrying the pollen from one flower to another. Next slide. So basically, all that slide is saying is it's the same in the UK, it's the same worldwide, it's certainly the same in India. And on we go. I think on we go. So this is one of the things that there's a huge amount of research going on, and I could have given a whole day of talks on this particular slide. But there has been great controversy about neonicotinoids, which are chemicals that are very widely used. And the argument from agricultural people who are pro-neonicotinoids is, of course, it prevents disease and prevents infestations. Now, the problem is that it has now been proven that even by just treating the seed with a neonicotinoid, it carries on through the leaf, into the flower, into the pollen, and into the nectar. So they are arguing, it has been argued, that by treating the seed, you're restricting the distribution of these toxic chemicals. But it is now categorically, literally in the last 6 months or so, been proven that that is no longer the case, and it is definitely affecting the wild bee population. And the next slide will show you, tip of the iceberg. And the next slide, this comical slide, shows you the most recent thing is that it's sublethal doses, sorry, so that it's not necessarily killing the bees in itself, the chemical, but what it is doing is making them go a bit haywire. And it's now thought that it's affecting the olfactory area in their noses so that they cannot smell where the forage is. So they then get confused and hungry and they don't go back to the hive. So it is not directly killing, but indirectly killing the wild as well as the domestic bees. So this is really where it gets jollier, because obviously I'm not going to get into the politics of pollinators. The thing that I think is incredibly important as a gardener and somebody who teaches gardeners is that it can start with us. And I'm a great believer in the bottom up. And so I sort of really try and encourage when I'm teaching that there are 4 exceptionally simple things that you can do in your own backyards, in your own gardens, that will help, and that you are not allowed to think that you're irrelevant. Because again, there is very current research in the UK that gardeners and the role that gardeners play in the plight of the pollinator and the amount of forage that is available is hugely, hugely important. With the chemicalization and laboratory creation of the countryside, as more and more of the world is taken over to grain production and not flowering plants production, this is getting more and more important. And our gardens are key as a way of reversing the trends. So there are 4 things, very simple. We'll go through these very quickly. Don't be over tidy. Don't make your lawn look like a golf course. Because your lawn, this is a classic, this is Sissinghurst, a classic British site mowing the lawn to have this effect. Next slide. But of course, what you're doing with that, next slide, is you are cutting away the clover and the daisy that was there. They take 8 days in their regrowth from a cut to a flower. So if you moved from mowing your lawn every week, even to every 2 weeks, you at least get 5 or 6 days of forage that you wouldn't get otherwise, and it doesn't look a mess. So even by doing something as simple as that, by literally just changing our mowing regime, and if you can imagine this in gardens, but also in towns and parks, you have potentially really quite a significant impact on the amount of national forage that is available. So very simple things. Next slide. Daisies, next slide. Clover, all fantastic nectar-rich, pollen-rich plants. And the lotus family, the trefoils, also very important. Next slide. And so allow your lawns to do a bit more of this. This is actually a very famous garden in the UK called Great Dixter, where they no longer have lawns, they have wildflower meadows. The next thing that you can do very simply is to have water in your garden. And when I had a wildflower biodiversity edit on my own garden, I got 9 out of 10, not 10 out of 10. And the one I was missing was the water. So I did not have any water in my garden. And they need a huge amount, particularly, again, the wild bee needs 2 litres of water to keep a hive at the right temperature when it's hot. And that would be even more so here. And it takes 44,000 journeys for a hive to get that amount of water. So the longer the journey, the more they're actually consuming of food to get that water. So the more you can distribute shallow water, particularly through your garden in this sort of way, but this is not ideal. The next slide is more ideal. So shallow water that they can just come around the edge and very easily access water without drowning. And next slide. Even bowls like this that you change every couple of days with rainwater will make a real difference to the success and health of a hive. And then always have something in flower early to late. So don't just have a really flowery moment when you're in your garden. Have it all the way through. So in the UK, I concentrate on crocus and early bulbs. So next slide. And we're going to hear about how we can hopefully take this into a more Indian content. So this is crocus and the early flowering iris, very pollen and nectar rich, and incredibly important for when the queen bee are emerging from hibernation. And next slide. And then finally, the other thing that's absolutely key is to grow the right plants. And I didn't know this until I started studying this, and I'm sure lots of you will know what the right plants are, but we're just going to finish with that, which is, next slide, not doubles but singles. It's kind of obvious, but if you look at this flower, you can't see the center of the flower. You need to see the center of the flower, because otherwise the pollinators can't see it, and they can't. What has happened is that those nectaries at the center of the flower have been bred to be petaloids, so little mini petals. And so that plant is totally sterile. It has no nectar, so it's got no reason to draw it in. This is a totally sterile dahlia. It has no central section that you can see. The nectaries have been bred to be mini petals. Next slide. Whereas this is, you can clearly see the center of the flower. And you can clearly see this by sitting in your garden. I get a chair sometimes and just sit there and watch which things are being visited. Well, they're not stupid insects, so they're not going to visit unless there's forage for them there. And so all these things, cosmos and dahlias, are all absolutely perfect if they are singles, not doubles. And then I remember also a very good pollinator scientist describing to me it's really important to have high-rise cafes of nectar and pollen and big globes, because then the pollinator can come and it can forage from the bottom, normally with something like a spike. The flowers start at the bottom, and it can forage all the way up, so it can get enough just in that 12 inches or 30 centimeters to then return to the hive. It's got enough forage. And similarly, with something like an allium, a big globe, there are so many of those tiny flowers that make up actually one flower that it doesn't need to travel. Again, it doesn't need to use its precious energy to go back, so it can just stay there, and then it's done its day's work. And so you see that with a classic English flower, which is a foxglove, and alliums, which are obviously triumphantly good. And this is chives, actually. This is garlic chives, which are pretty multicultural. And they are the thing that are most visited in my garden of any. And I was worried when we had commercial hives in the garden that all our honey would taste of garlic, but it didn't. It was a slight anxiety, but it was absolutely fine. But they are the most visited plants, the alliums, in the whole garden. And again. And so, yeah, exceptionally long flowering and at the right time. So if you just give me 2 seconds to describe what I mean by this. What's been found by the Sussex Bee Laboratory just outside Brighton with observer hives, which are where they've got glass, and so you can see into the hive. And you all know the thing about the waggle dance. Do you all know that thing where they waggle their bottoms? The figure of 8. And what they're telling you is you need to go in that direction for that distance. And it's the most incredibly sophisticated and wonderful and absolutely specific way of communicating in the hive. And they will tell the rest of the hive where the good forage is that day. So they won't go willy-nilly looking for it. They'll say, if you go right, southeast 3 miles, then turn right, you will find a garden that has fantastic forage. So don't bother to go that way, go that way. And they communicate over the whole hive. And they've done this wonderful research, and what they have found is they've refined the knowledge of that process, but also they've found that in the UK, where the forage is lacking due to our complete destruction of the countryside, is an odd time that you wouldn't necessarily think, but it's actually August and September. Because before that, there is all-seed rape in our fields, which makes rapeseed oil, and so there's lots of forage. And after that, you have ivy. And ivy is one of the commonest plants in the UK. Fantastic nectar-rich plant. So oddly, it's between those 2 crops, so it's July, August, and a bit of September, where there's a real dearth, and you get really proper colony decline and death. So that is exactly when, in the UK, you want to be in your garden. So you can make it super colourful, super floriferous, and it produces fantastic forage. So it's a win-win all round. So I just selected 3 families of plants that will grow very happily here in intense heat. I've seen them here already. I know they grow here. The Cosmos family. Cosmos Purity, if you like white. Wonderful en masse. I mean, this is in Sussex, but it would do just as well here. And another lovely plant, which is fantastic for hoverflies. Hoverflies like platforms because they're little, and they get blown up away around too much. So they love plateaus, they love umbels, because they can land there and they can move with, still feeding with the umbel. Similarly, butterflies also like flat platforms because they've got a big surface area. So if it's windy, they again get blown apart. Bees are they have a much wider spectrum of plants that they can feed from. So again, other cosmoses, this is still okay. So some of the nectaries have been bred to be petaloids, but most haven't. So this has still got nectar. This is a variety called Psyche White, Cosmos Psyche White. And that's en masse. And then picked in a bunch, so all these make nice bunches. And then this is a variety called Daydream, and you can see from this that Cosmos are peculiar in that they are very nectar-rich and they're very pollen-rich, so they give us both, and they give them both. And that's Cosmos Dazzler en masse. And then the zinnias. Now, I never believed that zinnias would be good pollinators because they look too fancy, too pretty, too sort of pom-pommy and jolly. But again, you just have to observe them, you just have to sit and watch them, and you will see they are visited continually by things with long proboscis. So again, these are particularly for the butterflies. So onwards, next slide. This is Zinnia Bonari's Giant Lime, a very good variety, and Queen Red Lime. And these are the 2 that have been, the nectar has been analysed to have the richest content of sugar, and so carbohydrate. And they're beautiful, they're beautiful. It's a win-win situation for the bee and for us. And that's growing in the garden. And then the final family, which of course are superb for us and for the pollinators, are dahlias. Next slide. But not this. This is lovely, but it's not good for the pollinators. And hopefully now you can see why. And this, same problem. Whereas this, you can see immediately, well, it looks almost like those are petals, but they're not actually, they're nectaries. These are called the anemone flowered dahlias. And the butterflies love them because it gives them a platform, and they can just put in their long proboscis and get the nectar. And this also has pollen. So you can see this has pollen and nectar. And so it's very busy with particularly with worker bees in a commercial hive. This is Magenta Star variety. And that is Blue Bayou on the right and Magenta Star in the middle, both fantastic for pollinators, two of the most visited varieties. And this is Bishop of Oxford. So the whole Bishop series of dahlias are single varieties and fantastic for pollinators. Now, again, hopefully now you'll understand which in this vase are good for pollinators and which are not. Half and half, or one third there is good, 2/3 aren't. So you can see which. This is fantastic. It's a variety called Waltzing Matilda. And this is Totally Tangerine. So these are, and with a cosmos. And this is Just Juliet. And so one from final slide. So this is zinnias and dahlias. And every single one of those in that vase is wonderful for pollinators and wonderful for picking and wonderful as garden plants. So again, it's a win-win situation. And so back to the final slide, which is just to say, you know, gardening should be full of colour, should be full of stuff to pick, in my view, to harvest, whether it be food or flowers, and should be good for the pollinators. And if you start doing it, please then tell 10 other people to start doing it, and then they tell 10 other people to start doing it, and we can make a change.
Thank you, Sarah. There were some ideas there that I didn't know about. I'm very happy to pick up on them, such as the fact that the double varieties are actually no good for bees. You know, I actually visited the UK after a gap of about 7 or 8 years last year, and I was quite interested to see that there's a very visible change in the look of gardens and public roundabouts. You know, the grasses are more lank, they're taller, they're less tidy. Have you had an influence on this? Is this something that has, you know, been widely disseminated as an ideal thing to do?
I think one of the things about television that is very good, there are many bad things about television, but one of the very good things about television is that you can communicate with a huge number of people. And I made a series 6 years ago about this whole dilemma and what gardeners could do about it. So very domestic, really, but also what town councils and country councils could do about it. And I think it's in the zeitgeist, isn't it? But you know, certainly I was part of a movement to get councils to stop spending money on buying very, very hybridized begonias and geraniums, which have no pollen, and to grow cheaper plants that need less water and are simpler to look after, and to stop mowing their lawns. And Birmingham Council was about to go bust and save £2 million in a year by just changing from previous practices to more pollinator sympathetic practices, which is basically slightly less maintenance. But there's always an issue, and I don't know if that's so much here. But the biggest battle that we had, interestingly, in the campaign to try and up the pollen and nectar count in the countryside was stern ladies who were head of the parish council in the middle of a village. And they were the ones who were the hardest to turn, because they wanted their village to win the tidiest village competition. And they wanted what used to be a rough area of grass, perhaps with some grazing on it, but quite rough, full of flowers, which would be the common in the middle of the village. They wanted it mown every 5 days. So as soon as a daisy might come. So the only forage that the country villages currently have is the graveyard, because it is a less maintained and mowed area. And so where often the wildest and most interesting, the rarest wildflowers are found now is there. But so, because of, anyway, there's not just the busy, bossy lazies, but also people in cars. There's a health and safety addiction in the Western world. And cow parsley, which is fantastic for pollinators, councils get thousands of phone calls in May saying, why haven't you cut the lane? Why haven't you cut the lane? I can't see across that corner and I'm going to have a crash. So we have to change this attitude. There is, over-sterilization and a lack of sympathy to nature. I didn't answer the question really, did I?
Oh, no, you did partly. But, if I look at the city that I live in, which is New Delhi, the things that strike me when I've seen your talk is, firstly, that we have much harsher conditions. We don't have rain through the year like you do. We have this one single pulse of the monsoon, and then effectively a drought for 10 months of the year, right? We have intense heat in summer. So to be able to actually do a flower garden that is bee-friendly would be much more difficult. But actually, what is one of our biggest difficulties is the ideas of the English garden that was bequeathed to us by the British when they were here. And there are manuals of what the garden should be like that were written sometimes for official bodies like the Archaeological Survey of India, where people actually said, well, this is how you should maintain your lawn, these are the kinds of hedgerows you should have, this is what you should do. And many of those ideas continue because we've never really questioned gardening practice in our cities.
Well, that's why I tried, sorry to interrupt, but that's why I tried to just finish with those three, because I have seen the best dahlias growing in Sri Lanka, zinnias up to here in a primary school garden, from a packet of seed that the kids had thrown out up to here, much better than ours, and similarly cosmos. They're very heat tolerant, they're very drought tolerant, so those three families of plants would be versatile. But you're right, is you don't want an English garden. I hate English gardens. I lived at Sissinghurst for 10 years. I kind of love it and I kind of hate it. But I want a more Indian garden, and so do the bees.
Yeah, and nobody seems to know what an Indian garden actually is, because we've kind of lost touch with what an Indian garden might have been like.
Well, I want a sari garden. That's what I want.
Well, sari gardens exist, but they don't like bees. And bees don't like sari gardens.
Okay.
One of the types of gardens that we do know a little bit about are the Mughal Gardens, which tend to be extremely formal and extremely confused about what kinds of plants to have in them, partly because the people who plant them up tend to look at old, what are called namas, which is the Persian word for the books that were named after particular emperors. So you had the Babur Nama or the Shah Jahan Nama, and so on. And they would ransack these namas for the names of plants that were mentioned in them. And the plants mentioned in them were often plants that were, in Samarkand or in what is now Afghanistan or in Kashmir. And then the attempt would be to plant those plants in Delhi, where the climate and the rainfall regime is, it's crazy. So we actually are in a complete mess in our cities. And it's also the fault of our civic authorities, who are completely disinterested in the whole business of gardening. So but I want to ask you two ancillary questions. One is, what do you think of the whole GMO conundrum? Are you one of those people who believes that genetically modified plants are terrible? If so, I want you to just talk about that for a bit.
Yes, I thought you might ask me that. I have two levels in which I work. As an ex-medic, as a ex-scientist, in a way, or scientifically trained, I have real sympathy to the GMO argument because of food security. But as an emotional person who believes in the localization and the plant community that needs to be specific to an environment, I'm deeply, deeply against them. So on a personal level, I avoid GMO. Because I do think it is the tip of the iceberg, and I'm a signed up member of the Soil Association in the UK, and it troubles me, but I'm not completely resolved about it, so I'm afraid I'm going to sit on the fence, but I'm definitely, if you make me move, I would move to saying I would rather not move to GMO.
But is your naysaying about the precautionary principle, or is it because you know of downside, negative effects with
I think that people who produce the pharmaceutical companies that produce chemicals, herbicides, have a commercial incentive to produce things that, as we know, like glyphosate, and a resistance. And that deeply troubles me, that we then will get, well, we were talking earlier about the colonization of imported plants, and I think that it is letting a dangerous genie out of a bottle until we know more and it is more controlled. I think when there is a commercial incentive, it's very, very difficult. I mean, I used to be a medic, and we used to get taken out by the pharmaceutical companies to very lavish entertainment, and I found that very disturbing, and in a similar way I find it disturbing because I think that if commerce is involved, then it isn't necessarily the right that comes to the top.
Yeah, I think that's a good. The other question, Sarah, is the question of exotic plants.
Yeah.
Now, there are some countries in the world that, and especially in the tropical belt, that are now deeply concerned about the dangers of having exotic plants come in. But looking at the pictures that you were showing us in the gardens, is it true that Britain is less concerned about this? Are you less affected by the dangers that can be posed by invasive exotics? Or
we have a few. It's very interesting because it's kind of where you draw the line. So where do you draw the line in terms of history? So when, do the Romans bringing something, does that count as now a British wildflower or not? Or, so where the historical line is drawn is difficult and complicated. And also how invasive it is. So for instance, bracken is an absolute disaster in every acid highland area, particularly in Scotland, and has just colonized great hillsides. We were talking about rewilding earlier, where in the initial stages of rewilding you get huge proliferation of bracken, and that is very bad for forage for almost everything. We also have Japanese knotweed in a city environment, which pushes up through basements and concrete. That is also a difficult invasive. And the Indian balsam actually is another invasive because the seed pods pop, and they're on the stream and riversides, and they pop into the river and get carried and just totally colonize hundreds of miles of riverbank, and destroy all the flora and then the fauna that goes with the flora in those areas.
So when you advise people about growing wildflower gardens, are you actually saying don't grow these things because they're dangerous, or do you not bother?
No, I don't. Again, I'm not a very black and white campaigner. I think that you have to be aware of these things. Rhododendron ponticum is another one, but I think basically the gain from introducing nectar and pollen-rich plants in a wildflower meadow setting is greater than the cost if there might be a seed strain in a meadow that comes from the Czech Republic as opposed to from Britain. But without doubt, if at all possible, you should get your neighbour who's got a wildflower meadow and collect it from his and put the seed onto yours. That's the ideal, but that's not going to happen in a cityscape.
We're going to leave the last 15 minutes for questions in case the audience wants to ask things, but so we have 5 minutes to just wrap this. I just wanted to say a couple of things. The whole business of the natural history of pollination is actually quite fascinating. I've written about this a little bit in the context of the flowers that you find in jungle trees, and it was wonderful to research this because you discovered that the form of the flower, very often the color of the flower, and almost always what rewards or what attractants were used by the flower all depended on the kind of pollinator that was being attracted. So, for example, the bombax, that is going to be in flower very soon in our cities like Jaipur and Delhi, has a waxy, bright red flower. And reds are not seen, because they're the long wavelengths, they're not seen by insect eyes. So they attract the birds. And because birds don't smell, they have no smell at all. So you see this wonderful fit between the kind of flower, the form of the flower, and the pollinator that's being attracted. The bats the flowers that want to attract bats always hang at some distance from the foliage because bats don't see very well, and it would be disastrous if the flower was hidden in among the leaves. So they tend to, in some cases, there's an African tree, an East African tree called the sausage tree, and it has a 4-meter long stalk, and the flower actually hangs way away from the canopy just so that the bat can actually find it by its mousy smell. Now, we may not like the mousy smell, but the bats like it, and it's produced it for the bats, not for us. So there is this wonderful fit between the natural world and the pollinators that come to it, and it's just gorgeous to explore it, isn't it?
It is.
Really.
Yeah.
I work with wild habitats, and I work fairly strictly by choosing plants that I think are native to a particular habitat, mostly for practical reasons, not for ideological reasons, But for example, I'm working in a fairly large landscape in Jaipur in the desert, where the stresses, the environmental stresses are huge. But when I started working there, the first job we had to do was to clear it of an invasive Mexican and South American tree that had completely taken over. And once that happened, then we actually scoured the desert to look for plants that we knew, that we could see were perfectly adapted to living in those conditions with very little rain, with the right kind of soil or similar kind of soils. And then it works. It works simply because once you've done that, you don't need to tend to your garden anymore. And it's been great to see the birds coming in, the butterflies, everything that can fly, basically.
Yeah.
Things that walk perhaps can't find it, but even in a bustling city, if you have 70 hectares of a little, wild garden, everything that flies can find it.
And what's exciting about that is how quick they find it, and it's extraordinary. There's a program at the moment, a project really, in West Sussex, about an hour from where I live, called the Knepp Castle Project, which you may know about. And what they've done there is they've allowed 3,000 acres just to return to wildness. So they haven't managed it, but they've put in grazers. So they've put in large cattle, longhorn cattle, pigs, which obviously forage and gouge up the ground. And already we only had 200 pairs of collar, the turtle dove. And it's on the red list now. It's in massive decline in the last 20 years. And already now 40 pairs have found in 3 years this particular place, which is amazing. So it happens really quickly. You think, where have they come from? Nightingales, cuckoos, all these birds in decline, and the purple emperor butterfly. But what's amazing is the speed that you can get things in reverse, which is so optimistic.
In Jodhpur, one of my regrets is that we didn't actually measure, we didn't do a baseline survey of the number of birds that we were getting in the park.
Right.
But it probably would have been in the 40s or 50s. Our bird count now is 190.
That's fantastic.
in 11 years, and so it really is absolutely
it is.
amazing.
It can be reversed.
Shall we go to questions,
Yes.
Sarah? All right, so we're going to take questions. Please try and keep them short and pointed. The lady at the back.
Me? Okay. I've been given the mic, so two short things. Firstly, as we live in Delhi, we live in flats now. People do not have gardens, and a lot of them do not have any natural light. Can we plant different trees so that throughout the year something will be flowering? Number one, to provide food for these animals. Secondly, rather than GM crops, is there not a ray of hope in CRISPR gene technology, where you're not introducing genes from other organisms, but basically you're speeding up a process which can be done naturally?
To answer the first bit, yes, you can plant trees, but the trouble about trees is that in a dry, deciduous context, you tend to have very particular times when things will flower. You probably know that in Delhi, all your trees will flower from about February to the end of May. And then it's really not flowering time after that. There are a few exceptions, but it's very, very exceptional. And the reason is actually very simple to understand. Trees need to count backwards from the monsoon, which is the only time when it's likely that a ripe seed will actually germinate on its own in moist soil. So trees tend to count backwards in terms of the time it takes for the fruit to form and for fertilization to happen. And that's why you get that slight variation. So a fruit that is woody will take longer. A fruit that might be pulpy and a berry will take a shorter time. And that's why you get this cascade of flowering from about February through till May. So it will be a challenge to look for trees that will flower throughout the year. I mean, maybe you'll have to reach for exotics, perhaps. But the GMO question I'm going to leave to you, Sarah, because I don't know enough about GMOs.
I think I don't really know enough about it, but what I do know a little bit about is that I think the mistake that we're making is to do this huge leap. What happens if you grow a seed in your own environment and you then harvest that seed that year, the following year, the following year? You are in a way selecting for your environment, because it is likely that the seed that you collect is from a flower that has done well. So you are selecting for your particular climate. At the moment, in the UK, 78% or 80% of our seed is grown in Morocco. So we are growing seed that is selected for a completely different climate to our own. So I'm more a believer in doing it in a more domestic setting, which is I always collect my own seed. And every time I do, there are certain plants. There's a particular plant that I love called Courgeot scandens, the cup and saucer plant. I couldn't germinate that at all 10 years ago, but by getting one plant to germinate, collecting seed from that, collecting seed from its babies, collecting seed from its babies, grown in my garden, I now get 95, 98% germination rate. So that's the sort of modification that I would do, the selection that I would do.
So favouring adaptation.
You're favouring adaptation, but for your own particular environment.
Okay, next question.
Not
So
part
I
four.
understood that chemical fertilizers and pesticides cause less flowering, hence less pollination. So do you have a recipe for some homemade fertilizer or pesticide that we could easily make at home and use in our small gardens?
Yeah,
on a smaller scale.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really good question. And yes, there are. I mean, in terms of fertilizer, I mean, we have nettles and we have something called comfrey. And obviously I'm really sorry, I'm too ignorant about India to tell you, but basically nettles have an extremely high concentration of nitrogen, and comfrey has an extremely high concentration of potassium and potash. And what you do is you make a tea, and you just get a bucket and, or even a dustbin and cram it full of the leaves and fill it with water. Ideally, the bucket has a tap, and you leave it to stew for 3 weeks with both, and it makes the most disgusting smelling liquid. But what it is absolutely brilliant organic fertilizer, which has a very, very high concentration of those things. So if you then want to mix that also with rotting seaweed, you then have a broad spectrum organic fertilizer that is actually quite fun and quite easy and quite quick to make. And you then dilute that tea 1 to 10 to use on your tomatoes or your chilies or whatever, in the case of potash, because that's for fruiting plants, and for the leafy plants you want more of the nitrogen. Then onto disease prevention. A healthy plant is a stronger plant, so we can sort of assume that in a way. But there are certain things, I mean, like chrysanthemum juice is a very good insecticide. Rhubarb juice is incredibly good against aphids, against whitefly. So again, you would need to find what you have here, but there will be organic insecticides that you can make at home that are non-toxic, and there will certainly be organic fertilizers.
So, as far as organic fertilizers are concerned, we have so much in this country. It's really, it's a no-brainer. But with regard to pesticides, the net is actually a fantastic resource.
Yeah.
If you type in your problem, you will get all kinds of solutions. But what people do as well is they look at what's called IPM, Integrated Pest Management. So they actually look for predators of pests in order to try and cure a garden of certain kinds of insects that might be, invading your plant. So look at IPM as well as a possible solution to pest problems.
Yeah, biological control.
Hi, thank you for your perspectives. I was wondering about your perspective and outlook on colony collapse disorder.
Well, I'm not going to go into that because it's such a massive subject and we have 8 minutes left. But basically, the causes appear to be the same, except there's one additional one. So it's habitat destruction, it's lack of, and with that, lack of forage. The key, it's chemical use. But the key other one is the varroa mite, so the pest, which doesn't appear to have had such a bad effect on wild bees and wild pollinators as it does on domesticated honeybees. And no one really knows quite why, apart from concentrations of colonies in a very restricted area. So in a honey field of hives, there will be more close, and so you might get complete colony collapse in that way. But the domesticated bee is a whole different subject in a way. But you probably know more about that than I do by answering those three things. But those are the three things that are thought, and a different emphasis on either of those appears to be the common parlance at the moment.
I have one horrible story that I read about domesticated bees and commercial honey, which I want to share with you, and that is that, the world's biggest producer of honey is China. They export huge quantities of China, and everywhere in the West in particular, there are very strict regulations about how much antibiotics is tolerated in honey samples, because obviously if you get antibiotics in your honey, you're going to be eating those antibiotics and building up resistance to antibiotics in your own body. And China, about 6 years ago, exported one particular consignment of 80 tons of honey to Germany. And when Germany tested the honey, they found that the concentrations of antibiotics were 6 or 7 times higher than the maximum level. So they sent it back. They said, you have to take it back. We're not going to let this into the country. And China then said, all right then, well, is there anybody out there who might want some cheap honey? And guess who said yes? It was a commercial company from this country, I'm very ashamed to say. And that honey is circulating now in our markets. Next question.
Hello. But in my search of vanishing bees and butterflies, I've come across a few studies. One of them is that the mobile signals are interfering with the signals of bees, and that's why a lot of honeybees are dying and they're committing en masse suicide because they just lose their way back home. And but as a matter of fact, somewhere near Chittorgarh, there used to be a few different kind of honeybees which are totally vanished now, and I don't know if they were found anywhere else. So that is one thing. The other thing is weeds, the wildflowers and weeds that grow along with the crop. So as you said that as we're looking for the most sterile crops and everything, so we call it kharpatwar here, and we are trying to destroy that, and that has also caused the vanishing bees and butterflies. So could you just throw some light on that?
Well, that's completely right. I mean, that's the destruction of habitat, is that when I was making this television series, we filmed in the middle of a field. It was a field. When I was a child, a field was alive. I was surrounded by birds and insects. You couldn't hear a single thing. There was no bird song. There was no insect activity whatsoever. It was like a laboratory for as far as I could see. And exactly what you say is the weeds are what we need. The understory is what needs to be there. But but it's completely absent. So the countryside now in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure in intensive agricultural areas of India, have become a laboratory, which is why our gardens, I know it's more complicated here, but our gardens are the key repository for these things. You know, there aren't enough nature reserves. There simply aren't enough. So it is terribly important that hedgerows, hedge sides, ditch sides, whatever, should be allowed to be natural and not sprayed also.
And you have to remember that the word weed is a value judgment.
Yeah.
You know, there's no such thing as a weed. The weed is what you choose to label a weed because it's an unwanted plant. And there are things that perhaps, you know, people would not want. I mean, something like Parthenium, which is invasive and a real nuisance, is, to my mind, or at least in my garden, a weed. But lots of other things that people call weeds are not weeds for me.
I wanted to respond to this lady's comment. When you talk about weed being also, its food waste is also is not considered, it's not waste. So you can actually use your food waste and do an anaerobic kind of composting. And it's very easy to do in an apartment. If you go online to Green Tech, there are many companies, but I use Green Tech, and it's very easy to do. And in terms of nettle, etc., we don't have that much of that here. But marigold, planting of marigold is great. You can plant garlic, and you can do a small little thing on your apartment balcony. It's extremely easy to do. So I suggest Green Tech. And Panchagavya is something that we have, that's our heritage. And with cow dung, and you make a tea with that. It's a little smelly, but it's great fun. And there's just so much of benefit. So look up Panchagavya.
Thank you. We have the last 2 minutes, so maybe 2 questions or 3 if they're short. The lady here.
Hi, I'm just asking for some practical advice. I have a very small patch. So are you saying that, one shouldn't regularly kind of cut the grass, mow the grass, and just let it grow for maybe for a month? And it looks a bit wild, but...
Yeah, but it doesn't if you move from... In a dry climate like here, you won't need to mow nearly as much. But if you just halve the amount, so you double the amount of... You spread the regularity of your mowing times 2, you will have a huge difference. Probably. I mean, you'll have to look and see when the flowers come. But it's when the flowers have come, you don't have to leave it to be up to here, but just leave it a little bit more until the flowers come and then cut it. And then, so just change your regime to accommodate your own environment and your mix to allow it to have the flowers.
Okay.
I want to add to that, in India, we are a completely illiterate country when it comes to growing grasses, ornamentally or even just for pleasure, But there's a vast, have you any idea how many grass species we have in this country? It's something like 1,200 species of grasses. How many do you know? You probably know duba, which is the crabgrass, the Bermuda grass that we learned how to plant, 100 years ago. And that's the only grass that we use for lawns, But there's actually a whole wonderful range of beautiful grasses. Some lank, some short, some spreading, some stoloniferous, but just a beautiful range of grasses which you should actually explore just by going outside and looking. I regularly, for example, grow a particular grass called Opulus menis, which comes up in the rains and only grows in the shade. And people keep asking me, grasses won't grow in the shade. Of course they will. You have to learn how to look. So just start looking around you and pick up the grasses that you see, and grow them at home. They're wonderful. I think are we out of time? We are. Okay, last question.
You said bees get attracted to flowers by their sense of smell and color. But sometime back, I had bought this hummingbird feeder from the US. We don't have hummingbirds, but we have sunbirds. And I thought maybe, I could use them to attract the sunbirds. So I put sugar water inside. I didn't get any sunbirds, but I got a whole lot of bees coming to the sugar water, which didn't have any color or smell. So how do you explain that?
What makes you think it doesn't have a smell?
No.
You can't smell it.
I think it probably does smell. You know, sugar
Sugar,
syrup
I mean,
will smell.
The manufactured sugar which we get at the grocers. Water. But then I would put water otherwise also for the birds. The bees wouldn't come to the water, but they came to the sugar.
But also,
solution.
remember the waggle dance. We all must remember, you only need to get one bee to discover your sugar syrup, and then they all start doing this, and you're fine.
And they had drowned in the sugar solution, so many of them. You know?
But what Sarah's saying is that you may
Shallow.
not be able to smell
Shallow.
the sugar, but they can.
And also-
we have very limited olfactory sensible sense.
But also they will drown, so do it shallow. Very shallow in a bowl, because then they don't drown. So probably you've got a well, have you? A sort of,
Right.
like a cup shape. So just do it very flat, and then they can feed, but they don't drown.
We have
Right.
to wind up now, Sarah. Thank you so much for giving us so many lovely ideas and lovely visuals.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
comparing.